Strauss visited Berlin to help his friend Clemens Krauss with a conducting masterclass, and on his birthday, which was the 11th of June, he went to see Karajan conduct Elektra, and I believe that was the first time that they ever met in person.
Today we welcome Matthew Werley in the Karajan Institut. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you, Pia.
You are a musicologist and the General Secretary of the International Richard Strauss Society. Would you like to tell us a little bit about this society?
Yeah, the society was founded by an associate of Richard Strauss in 1952. It was hosted out of Berlin. It then moved in the 70s to Vienna, and from last year we are now based here in Salzburg.
Okay. And Richard Strauss was very important for Karajan's career and for his life. And they met when he was conducting Elektra in Berlin. So how was that? In 1940, I think, this performance happened.
That's right, yes. Strauss visited Berlin to help his friend Clemens Krauss with a conducting masterclass, and he had a number of meetings, and on his birthday, which was the 11th of June, he went to see Karajan conduct Elektra, and I believe that was the first time that they ever met in person. Karajan met Strauss backstage afterwards and was very impressed by what he heard in the orchestral pit.
And I think there was letters going back and forth between them afterwards.
Yeah, there's a number of letters between Karajan and Strauss, and also a few memoirs from Karajan about this meeting in Berlin. Strauss was really shocked to have seen Karajan conduct this work from memory. I don't think he had ever seen anyone conduct an opera by memory before, particularly Elektra, which is a very complicated score. And he really complimented him on this, but he said, obviously things change in a live performance, and the piece itself will change the next time you do it, and so will you. So Karajan really relished this advice that he received from the 76-year-old composer. There are some letters from later years. Karajan was, I think, not quite satisfied with the acoustic in the Berlin State Opera, and he wanted some funding to have it renovated, have some additional shields put in to improve the sound. And Strauss was the conductor in Berlin for 20 years, around the turn of the century and into the end of the First World War. And so he wrote a letter to Strauss asking for his support for these renovations to improve the sound. And that was towards the end of the war, and of course there was not enough funding to carry out such improvements. But it shows that he felt that Strauss would be a sympathetic supporter of these improvements, and it shows, I think, one of the last known contacts between the two men. In 1944, I believe, is when those letters date from.
Interesting. And we talked before that Richard Strauss is known for his revolutionary sound. So what is so revolutionary about Richard Strauss's compositions?
Well, Strauss was really a prodigious talent. I mean, he grew up in a very musical family. His father, Franz Strauss, was known as the Joachim of the horn in the 19th century, played in the first performances of many Wagner operas in Munich and in Bayreuth, and so he had this close connection to Wagner's sound world, and he really absorbed that as a young man and as a teenager. And when he started composing, when he was in his late 20s, early 30s, he was able to write for an orchestra with this very luscious sound that you just don't find in any of his contemporaries. And I think when he was composing in the late 1890s, early 1990s, it was really the hottest piece of musical real estate in the 19th century. And this continued up until the First World War, when he started really becoming known as an opera composer. And he chose subjects, for the most part, that were very shocking for 19th century sort of conservative sort of publics. And this combination of this sort of accepted form of musical composition, this very recognized, this sort of standard of musical excellence, was of course the Wagnerian tradition. For Strauss to be able to compose in that, but then break away by using these very profane kind of subjects like Till Eulenspiegel, this sort of character who thumbs his nose up at the world and the establishment, all the way through to Feuersnot and Salome, and of course Elektra, which is just a shocking piece of revenge and anger on the stage here. He uses it all in the kind of clothing of Wagner, but really moves it forward with these almost expressionist works by the first decade of the 20th century. And I think that this is, he commanded the respect of all of his contemporaries, whether or not they liked him or not. So this is what really caused even people like Schoenberg to talk about Strauss, even in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, as really the only revolutionary figure of our generation.
So there was this real need to break away from Wagner during that time.
Yeah, there was this expectation amongst composers around the turn of the century that the Wagnerian tradition must somehow be extended. The world premiere of Parsifal in 1882 was really the last international success of German opera. Then you have these other composers. You have the Verismo tradition, you have Puccini, and of course Verdi operas are extremely popular at the time. But there was really no successor to that Wagnerian tradition. And so Strauss thought, well, we need to find a way out of that. And Strauss read a lot of Nietzsche and Schopenhauer, and he was very close with Cosima Wagner in the 1890s. And he said, you know what, there's something here, but he took a different path, and one that really embraced a kind of this rejection of musical metaphysics, the idea that there's something, that when one listens to music, that there's something beyond, there's something almost quasi-religious about music.
Transcendent.
Transcendent. And so for him it was important to offer something materialistic, that the listener would always be sort of entertained. These luscious scores, these almost three-dimensional musical canvases, would really just hold the listener in their seat and entertain, so that they were not thinking about anything else beyond that musical surface, anything transcendent. They were just mesmerized, and you even see this with the premiere of Salome. People would go back day and day again to hear this work. They were repulsed by that, but they could not figure out how he managed to compose this work. The harmonies, the orchestration, the lyricism, the kitsch all blended together. This is something that they had not ever experienced before. And I imagine for someone like Karajan, he was the real innovator of the generation beforehand. And so I think that there is that deep interest there in what Strauss was doing with orchestras, with material and things like that.
Is there something like a special approach to Richard Strauss when it comes to Karajan's interpretation?
That's a really interesting question, Pia. This is one I think that I still am not quite entirely certain about. In fact, I'm organizing a little conference in September with Matthias Rode and Dominik Schädewy, who's the director of the Strauss Institut in Garmisch-Partenkirchen, because Strauss was also a very, very famous conductor and also a very prolific pianist. He was a leader accompanist, many different singers, his wife. above all. But he performed as many as sort of 6,000 times throughout his life, which is on par with someone like Karl Böhm or Daniel Barenboim. He was a prolific performer, and he left behind a kind of school of conductors. Strauss didn't really leave behind composition students. He helped mentor a few, but he was not really known as a composition teacher, but he was known as a mentor to many other conductors. Clemens Krauss, Karl Böhm, George Szell, Schulte was also an assistant of his, and they all had a very, very lean, quicksilver approach to Strauss's compositions, his symphonic poems. Karajan is an interesting case in that regard. If you listen to his early recordings of Strauss, his first recording was with the Concertgebouw in 1943 of Don Juan, which is of course the work that he also gave his conducting debut with here in Salzburg in 1929. He uses very quick tempi. The orchestration moves, doesn't get bogged down in the details. It's very classical, in short. It's a very Mozartian approach, and that's the way Strauss conducted. The further along in Karajan's career, you hear him slowing things down and broadening out the tempo. It almost sort of reverts to a very Wagnerian, almost static kind of tempo, and so it's a complicated issue with Karajan, and I do see Karajan as kind of a separate tradition to those of the Karl Böhm and George Szell and even Wolfgang Sawallisch and Fabio Luzzi, who are those kind of the traditional Strauss conductors. But it's clear that Strauss's works and Strauss's symphonic works and his operas really meant something for Karajan, and because they really delineate these career milestones in his career.
Mm-hmm. Could we go into that? When did he conduct? His first conducting debut was with Richard Strauss with Don Juan, and then we have several stages within Karajan's life where Richard Strauss played a very important role within his career. When was that?
Well, it's he was when he was working in Ulm and in Aachen, he conducted the more popular Strauss operas, Salome, Electra, and Rosenkavalier, but he only really conducted a handful of the symphonic works at that time. It really comes after the Second World War, when he goes into the studio for the first time with the Metamorphosis in 1947, does the very first studio cut of that work, which had only been composed 2 years previously at the end of the war. And really it's the 1950s though, in the kind of the decade in between when he's doing these recordings for Walter Legg,
with the Philharmonia
the Philharmonia, and also with the Vienna Philharmonic, and he really does a lot of Strauss in the 1950s, and that I kind of see that as culminating with his Deutsche Grammophon debut in 1959 with Ein Heldenleben.
Another debut
with Strauss. And then, of course, a year later, the opening of the Großes Festspielhaus, which, of course, he had a hand in sort of envisioning and shaping, with, of course, not a Mozart opera, but Der Rosenkavalier. Mm-hmm. And this is it's a mono recording, but there is such an energy to that work. And I think somehow the mono seems to allow the singers to really shine through in a way that, now of course had it been a stereo recording, we might have heard more detail, but it really comes across as such a singer's opera. And so I think you have all these milestones, and of course the debut with Alpen Symphony in 1980-81. It really does mark a lot of these milestones for Karajan's career. But yeah, I would say the 50s is really the high point. It begins to sort of then taper off a bit in the 60s and 70s, and then it sort of remains sort of at a plateau in the 1980s with studio recordings.
But for instance, the Metamorphosis is a work that stuck with Karajan, didn't it? So he conducted it throughout his life.
He conducted it throughout his life. I mean, he gave the premiere at the Salzburg Festival in 1948. That was his also return to Salzburg that year. And it features in pretty much every decade of his career, in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. And I also looked into it. It had only a handful of performances in Vienna. The Vienna Philharmonic, I think, only conducted it a total of, with other conductors up until sort of Simon Rattle, only sort of about 15 times in Vienna from the second half of since it was composed in the second half of the 20th century. Karajan only conducted it about 6 times overall, but of course he did that on guest tours with the Berlin and also sort of in Rome and in Venice and a number of other theaters and with other orchestras. So it was definitely a work he championed, and he also recorded it 3 times in the studio, and of course also once on film, at least once on film. So it's a work that it was for him very serious, and it really spoke to the kind of memory of the loss of this world that was destroyed in the Second World War. The Metamorphosis is a work which doesn't always receive applause. It is really a very, very deep meditation on the nature, on human nature, on the destruction of Germany in the Second World War. Above all, the destruction of opera houses. Strauss was incredibly despondent in 1944, 1945, that so many of these opera houses in Dresden and Berlin, in Munich and in Vienna were all destroyed. And he really saw opera as the kind of culmination of 2,000-3,000 years of cultural development. He really saw that as the absolute pinnacle. So this sort of 23, 25 minute work for 23 solo string instruments is a meditation on human nature at its low point. And of course there's this quotation at the end from Beethoven's Eroica symphony of this lament, this Trauermarsch, and it's an absolutely poignant moment in this work, and I think Karajan approached it with the due respect that work really requires. Mm-hmm. And so it's a wonderful document to be able to hear how Karajan returned to it at several points throughout his career.
And he did make some changes to the instrumentation, didn't he?
I think that there are clues that he added a few extra violins and violas, particularly in the development section of the work, in order to make the work sort of come through, particularly in the first recording in 1947. I mean, he was dealing with what would be considered today very, very primitive recording technologies, and when you have such a filigree texture of 23 solo instruments, it's difficult to really get the intensity to come through, and it makes sense to double a few of the instruments here and there to make that kind of come to the foreground.
And do you think that happened with the consent of Richard Strauss?
No, I don't think it happened with his consent. I mean, conductors do things in the studio. They're asked by the recording engineers, this isn't really working, let's try it again. We might need a few extra violins. Of course, they're on hand. He also recorded at the same time with Brahms's German Requiem. And so, of course, there were musicians to hand when he was recording this, and it would have been very easy to say, okay, we need a few extra double bass here. The bass isn't really coming through on this recording. So I think that those were all considerations. Also, the medium of these 78 RPMs it was recorded over, I think, 5 or 6 sides, and of course, the closer you get to the center of the disc, the more you lose bass sound. So of course, there's a need to supplement the instrumentation with extra strings, depending on where you have to flip the record over to the next side.
But that's interesting, because that's something that somehow stuck with Karajan. This bass sound that he was looking for. You can tell that within many recordings he did, that he was emphasizing bass. Maybe this has something to do with this sound ideal coming from this, what you just described.
Yeah, well, as soon as the recording technologies changed dramatically over his lifetime, so of course, when they got better, you were able to do more things, and the playback systems also got better. So people, particularly the German audiences or the consumers that he was recording and selling records to, were able to acquire more. I mean, it's astonishing after the Second World War how few people owned even refrigerators in Germany, and this just shoots up after the war, and people, with this sort of Wirtschaftswunder, the Marshall Plan, people are able to buy larger, also not just other Haushaltsgeräte, white appliances, but also recording systems and hi-fi stereo systems, and they get better, and they're able to buy larger ones, and they have the means in which to acquire these things. And so Karajan is certainly aware of that, and offers the listeners something that sounds good on their hi-fi systems. Yeah. And I think Strauss would have done the exact same thing. He also went into the studio a number of times throughout his career. This was around the First World War, but also up in the 1920s. 30s and even 40s, and he realized that there were limitations, and they doubled instruments or altered the scores, and he did that often with singers as well. Changed parts for singers who he respected, but knew later in life they weren't able to hit certain notes. He said, "Well, okay, well, I'll recompose it for you, and we'll bring it down a tone or more." And he was also a practical man. It wasn't necessarily about this. This is my Kunstwerk, and this is the thing I'm presenting, and it has to be that way, or don't even bother with it. He wanted to offer audiences something that was beautiful, something which engaged their imaginations, and also performers, conductors love to engage with on the stage, something that was fun.
That's really nice, because that's something that these two men also had in common. Because if you describe it like this, you could have also talked about Karajan himself. Yeah. So that's really interesting that these two people have so many things in common, although probably they have totally different characters.
Well, they both loved automobiles.
Yeah.
This is well known with Karajan, but Strauss even wrote a letter to Mercedes-Benz. He loved Mercedes, and he even offered to pose for a photo in front of Mercedes if you got a discount on Mercedes. Really? Yeah, there's a letter that was even published in the Mercedes sort of newsletter. He was obviously of a much older generation. He took his first airplane ride in 1947. He thought it was fantastic. He was more of the generation of sailing on ships, of course, to South America, and railways and automobiles. But he was very fascinated by modern technologies throughout his life, and of course also a very, very keen outdoorsman. He was a very, very enthusiastic mountain climber. Spent a lot of time in the Salzkammergut and around Salzburg and in Südtirol. Loved to travel with orchestras, with his close friends. So there's lots of parallels on the personal side of things between Karajan and Richard Strauss.
Thank you very much. Very interesting.
Well, thank you.
Thank you for being here.
Well, thank you for having me.